Hello and welcome to Future Squared. Stephen Hawking once said that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change, so let's adapt. My name is Steve Goveski, and each week I'll bring you conversations with preeminent thought leaders from a variety of fields to help you think in a multidisciplinary way, kick goals in your professional and personal life, and better navigate what is fast becoming a brave, new world. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation accelerator that works with organizations to unlock their people's latent potential to create more impact for humanity and lead more fulfilling lives. If you need help driving your organization's innovation strategy, visit collectivecampus.io. And without further ado,
come with me if you want to live.
You know, if you can eat the perfect diet, you can sit alone in the corner drinking your green smoothie, but your friends sitting around the bar having a beer might actually be healthier than you are at that given time because they're conversing with each other.
Welcome back to Future Squared for episode number 364 with Kale Brock. Kale is an award-nominated writer, filmmaker, and speaker. He's the author of several books, including The Gut Healing Protocol, The Art of Probiotic Nutrition, and Mandy Microbe's Big Gut Adventure. In his second documentary, the longevity film, Kale travels to the world's blue zones, longevity cultures, to investigate the dietary and lifestyle factors which cause such unprecedented health statistics in these areas. We unpacked Kale's journey into the heart of these blue zones to unpack how their inhabitants' attitude, community, nutrition, and movement sees them living lives, on average 5 to 10 years longer than those of us in the West. We challenge many long-held beliefs about health and wellness, and also attempt to answer that big question: what is happiness? With that, sit back and enjoy my conversation with Kale Brock. Welcome to the show, Kale.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program. You're joining me from Sydney's northern beaches, I understand.
Yeah, I just got back from a little trip to Bali yesterday, so back in the office, ready to get back to work.
Yeah, fantastic. And I see your hair's a little bit wet. You've just come out of the beach. Did you go for an early surf today?
No, it's a very busy time for me. So a couple of hours work already this morning, followed by a quick ocean dip. I always try and bring the ocean into my life at some point during the day. So This morning is just a quick dip, and it's still a little bit fresh at the moment, which is strange. Maybe that's just because I got back from Bali. Everything just feels a little bit colder.
Yes. What do they say? Comparison is the thief of joy. So
yes.
And speaking of going out for dips and surfing and whatnot, that's how I essentially discovered your work, initially with the How to Rip YouTube channel, which has over 60,000 subscribers at the moment. And I know you're starting your own channel as well on the surfing front. But then I thought, oh yeah, this guy's pretty cool. I'm going to add him on Instagram. And that's when I saw the fact that you've got a number of books, you've got a couple of movies, the gut movie, and most recently, you've been working on a film called the Longevity Film. What inspired the film?
That one was just an extension of, I guess, the work that I've been doing. So as you mentioned, I do have a whole lot of different work that I had done. And a lot of it was zooming in on the human body, zooming in on various experiences. And I think there was a need there to actually zoom out and look at things from a macro perspective. And that's where looking at different cultures who do health and well-being really well became sort of a priority for me, because I think that regardless of where the science goes, it's always going to be a bit of a rat race in terms of discovering the new thing, right? Like, what's the secret? What's the thing that's helping us achieve this or that? I think one of the best things that we can do to actually reapproximate and get really great health results is to look at people who do get great results and reapproximate what they do. So in terms of that, it was first about discovering, who was getting incredible results, where were they? And it turned out that the blue zone research and the longevity culture phenomenon was probably one of the best things to look at. And these are cultures and societies who experience incredible health and well-being for a really long time. They're living on average about 5 to 10 years longer than we do, and they're doing it with a fraction of the disease. In Okinawa, for instance, they have a 97% health span, which is, they spend 97% of their lives free of disease. Whereas here in Australia, for instance, we have half of all children living with a chronic health condition. So, this is pretty miraculous stuff. So that sort of phenomenon really inspired my curiosity. And whenever I'm curious about something, I want to share it and tell its story. So my platform happens to be film and videos. So that it's been the same with surfing, and it's been the same with gut health. And now we're sort of moving on to wellness and longevity. And it's been a pretty fascinating experience.
Yeah. And you mentioned Okinawa. For some reason, whenever I hear Okinawa, my mind shoots back to a little film from the mid-'80s called The Karate Kid and a little character called Mr. Miyagi, but that's a totally different story. You mentioned blue zones. So obviously living a longer life by 5 to 10 years versus the average in the West. But there were also 2 other blue zones you visited outside of Okinawa, Japan. What were they?
I went to Loma Linda, which is actually in California, and then I went to Ikaria in Greece, an island in Greece.
Awesome. And so aside from longevity, because for me, it's one thing to live a long life, but it's another to be healthy, lifespan versus health span, and also be happy. Just to unpack the notion of happiness, because it is quite a subjective measure, and it's something that perhaps we shouldn't be aspiring to feel 100% of the time as well. What does happiness mean to you?
I think for me, it's about living a life that's in alignment with your highest values. And your highest values might not be you want to be totally relaxed and feel like you're on holiday all the time. Your highest values might, and this is quite often the case, revolve around some sort of struggle and from which you derive some sort of meaning. And that tends to be quite a consistent theme amongst the Blue Zone cultures, at least, is that a lot of them have gone through very difficult times, and out of those difficult times, they've pulled meaning and a certain degree of humility and smugness. There's this beautiful, affable people there who you really want to be around. And I think that those are the definitions of happy to me. Is people who are just not overly worried about much, and from their struggles that they find a meaning and a purpose, and that gives them a really good stead in terms of their cerebral and emotional fortitude that they can sort of bring to life. So for me, it's just about living a life that's in alignment with my highest values, which happen to be, around surrounding work and family and friends and experiences, and not necessarily money or things or those sorts of things that we typically associate with being happy. I think a lot of people tend to say, once I get these things, then I'll be happy. When what I realized throughout, especially doing this film, is that if you're not happy during the process, you're probably not going to be happy for a long time when you achieve the outcome. So for me, it's really got to be about enjoying the process, and that's why I love filmmaking. Yeah, that's why I aspire to be in this industry and be surrounded by hopefully some of the best in the space as I sort of progress.
Awesome. Yeah, and there's definitely a few parallels I can draw from there. One being Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, in which she says that happiness is the achievement of your values, or living in accordance with your values. Another would be Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning, when he says happiness must not be pursued, it must ensue out of how you live your life, essentially. Whereas the chemical state of happiness is essentially a fleeting state, as is sadness, whereas most of the time we're in that space in between, homeostasis, right? So essentially, when you're talking about finding meaning in struggle, what kind of things did you unpack? And I know you posted something recently on Instagram from a village farmer there, where they find meaning in their work, and their work is not easy, particularly during those summer months.
Yeah, and if you go back even further, in somewhere like Ikaria, it was really ravaged by World War II. The same with Okinawa, in fact. there's still an American base in Okinawa, which has brought in a lot of Western influence into the country, into the island. Sorry. So these were times when some villages starved because of blockades during the war, and they didn't grow enough of their own food, so they starved. So you might expect to find, and this is what Viktor Frankl's work really centered around as well, is people who went through the concentration camps, the people who came out of that thriving and humble and really happy and grateful, were because they found meaning in that suffering. So I think that was a big occurrence in the longevity cultures, and there is this there's just this really nice smugness about the graceful ages anyway that I met, between 60 to 100 years old. These people do bring a very strong-mindedness, but at the same time a very big element of humility to the way that they live, and that's brought to their work. Like Elias, for example, who you were referencing in my Instagram. He is a 60-plus-year-old, very vital man, and he's working sometimes 8 to 12 to 14-hour days on the farm, and then going back to cook in the restaurant in the evenings. And it's a mark of pride. It's not burning the candle really, really fast at both ends. It's this slow burning approach. Like, we're going to go and work for 12 hours today in the harsh sun, but I'm going to take lots of breaks and I'm going to sit back and have a coffee at some point. Or they might smoke a cigarette at some point. A lot of people smoke cigarettes in these cultures too, which, breaks all the rules. So, they're approaching life differently. There's no, I've got to do this to achieve this. It's no, this is the work. This is the whole this is the whole point. So, it's almost like Ryan Holiday's work, The Obstacle is the Way. These guys really embody that idea that there's no other place that they need to be other than where I am right now. Yeah. So they do bring a lot of present state awareness to their work, and it's just fascinating. And you really notice that when you're there. And that was the big thing for us, is to try and convey that in the film. How do we convey present state awareness to people? It's about showing the little sound ups and the little things that happen that you might normally just cut out of a film. But instead it is, putting them in. It's like, hey, do you want a coffee? Why not? It's bringing all those things together, hopefully into a compelling story that really conveys that idea. But there's definitely some consistent themes that we found throughout the longevity cultures, which I think do contribute quite heavily to well-being and longevity. Yeah, well, it's like Elon Musk and others have suggested, happiness is essentially your expectations minus reality, in a way. And I feel in the West, there is this perhaps false expectation that we should be pursuing happiness at all times. And then when we don't get it, we inevitably feel that we're essentially unsatisfied with our lives, because we're not in this amazing state of unbridled enthusiasm for absolutely everything around us at all given times. And, you mentioned smoking is a big part of the culture over in Ikaria in Greece. And I think back to visiting my grandparents, who basically worked on a village in Eastern Europe in Macedonia. And one of my grandparents would literally smoke a pack a day. But he was always with his family. He was always out in nature. He was doing meaningful work, and he lived well into his 80s. So while I definitely don't endorse smoking, it just says a lot about getting those fundamentals right. Whereas in the West, I think there's a lot of focus on, float tank therapies and all this sort of stuff, but oftentimes neglecting time in nature, good relationships, and those, focusing too much on the icing without the cake, so to speak. Yeah, I think so. And that's probably the direction I went in when I first got into health and wellbeing, especially when I was younger, is to try and isolate various components of my life and try and get them right in this pursuit of ultimate wellness. When I think now what I've realized is that ultimate wellness comes from this optimal blend of the various pillars of life. And I think they largely center around nutrition, community, attitude, and movement. And once we get those four right, not just one or the other, that's when we can really thrive. Because I think we do try and break up and focus on and zoom in. Again, going back to that idea on various aspects of the human experience and obsess over them. There's a lot of fanaticism when it comes to diet, for instance. We know, you look at anyone's Instagram who's a vegan or whatever, it has to be in their Instagram, right? It's part of their identity is what they eat. And that sort of approach, it just doesn't work for long-term health and well-being. And it's so funny seeing just posting some stuff on social media. For instance, I posted that really fast cut of, hey, if you want perfect health, this is what you've got to do. And at the end of the clip, I say, well, that's what I used to think. So I kind of undo everything that I've said with this sort of underlying message like, oh, well, hey, maybe that's not the case. Anyway, because in the video I say, have salad and it better be protein and fat or something. You can see all the vegans like immediately stop watching the video and comment because they're like, no, I disagree with you. So it's really funny to see us get so caught up in just one aspect of health and well-being and longevity, and that's diet, when there is so much more. If you can eat the perfect diet, you can sit alone in the corner drinking your green smoothie, but your friends sitting around the bar having a beer might actually be healthier than you are at that given time, because they're conversing with each other, they're engaging with each other, that they have this cascade of neurochemicals that release because they're actually with friends and they feel secure and engaged and loved. So I think we've really got to shift the way we look at health and well-being as an individual pursuit that arises from digging and trying to force things to happen to one of more of a community approach where health and well-being kind of ensues as a byproduct of us actually pursuing more community-minded pursuits, if that makes sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned the 4 pillars of wellness, essentially, nutrition, community, attitude, and movement. And on community, I mean, if you zoom out several hundred years ago, thousands of years ago even, we used to live in tribes of maybe 50 to 100 people, and we'd get everything we needed from that tribe. There'd be the village jester. There'd be someone you turn to prepare food. There'd be all sorts of different roles in that tribe. And nowadays, it's so easy for us to go to the office, maybe speak to the same 2 or 3 people every day, go home, turn on Netflix and just veg out and look at our phones. I think the average person spends 3 hours a day looking at their phone, which equates to about 6 weeks a year, literally just mindlessly scrolling most of the time. So it feels like that community tribal aspect that used to be such a big part of humanity for 150 odd thousand years over the last, say, century, has kind of dissolved. And now we find ourselves often living in apartments on top of each other. And instead of saying hello to our neighbor, doing everything possible to avoid having to say hello. So, I mean, what kind of role is that playing in the health epidemic that you spoke of at the start of the show in the West?
I think loneliness has been identified quite recently in the latest research as being a major killer. It's worse for us statistically. It's worse for us than obesity, smoking, and substance abuse. It's quite a insidious sort of underlying thing that we don't talk about enough. Most people feel quite lonely because we've started to. 10,000 years ago, we were in those tribes around 175 interdependent, related individuals with sharing-based economies. Now we've gradually, since then, been broken down from tribes into family groups, and then from family groups into individuals. And this is what Daniel Vitalis spoke about when I interviewed him for the film. This has become to the point where all our devices have the word I in front of it, right? It's not the Wii phone, it's the iPhone. Yeah. So this is really breaking us down into individuals, and the way we engage with the world, the way we observe things is always from a me perspective. So that's changed. And I think we're seeing the results of that. Biologically, we're still living in that period where we did engage with other human beings every single day, and we had a much more community-minded approach. But we've kind of been, I think, baited and we've taken the hook, line and sinker on this whole thing that we need to pursue happiness from a me point of view. And again, this goes back to the whole idea that no, that's often not the case. I think a lot of self-care, instead of meditating, we should be going and have a conversation with friends. And this is not all the time, I'm just sort of saying, instead of going and getting the float take done, maybe we should go surfing with friends and get salt therapy that way. Instead of going, hey, I need time out to be alone and like recharge and blah, 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 maybe it's having a dinner with family. So it's all these different things that I think even introverts, that the research shows, benefit from actually engaging positively engaging with other people. So there's no really getting around this. We need to see people, and we need to see people every single day. When you bump into someone that you know and you have a good quality conversation and you feel engaged and you feel loved and secure, there is a cascade of neurochemicals that gets released, dopamine, anandamide, oxytocin, all these really powerful chemicals that not only have an impact on the brain, but the rest of the body as well. If you're in the research shows that if you're in a loving relationship, you'll release anti-inflammatory molecules throughout the body that will encourage health and well-being. If you're in a conflictual relationship with someone, you'll release more inflammation. So we need to start appreciating this a lot more. And that's where we need to actually bring in daily habits, and if even better, multiple daily habits that actually get us out conversing and engaging with people. This is something that's been massive for me because I work from home and I often work alone. So for me, it's about bringing in daily habits. So for me, it's going to the same 3 cafes up here on the northern beaches at least once a day, so going not to 3 a day, but going to one of them each day, just to get out of the house and go and chat with people. And we moved house since we got back because we wanted to be closer to the community and be around friends. And now we can't even walk down the street without bumping into people. Last night we were going shopping. We got back from Bali. We're exhausted, right? But we go to the shops to restock the fridge, and it's like bumping into everyone in every single aisle. It's like, hey, how you going? Hey, how you going? Hey, how you going? Yeah. Those sort of things are so important. We undervalue them because we don't know the consequences of not having them in our lives. And I think the consequences are we're incredibly lonely. We're not doing well, especially from a mental health point of view. I mean, we have over 300 million people around the world with depression, with suicide becoming a major killer, especially of our young people. It's the leading killer of young men, for instance. We need to actually address these things, and we're not doing that right now. We think the answer to community is having a community of numbers on our Instagram account. It means nothing. Community is actually in-person, interpersonal relationships, looking at someone in the eyes, giving them a hug, saying, hey, how are you? It's not sending them a text. The research shows that when we receive a phone call or we look at someone face to face, the benefits are far greater than receiving a text. So we really need to flip that. Everyone's talking about mental health online, but no one's talking about it in person. Why is that the case? There's all this, are you okay online? It's like, well, hey, why not pick up the phone? Why not go to someone's house? Hey, are you okay? We just don't have these conversations, and we need to, because the research shows, and also I think the film will show, that we ignore them at our own peril.
Yeah. And I think something you mentioned there about having those face-to-face conversations rather than it being, are you okay online, having that vulnerable conversation face-to-face does something, even if that conversation doesn't lead to a resolution, getting that stuff off your chest. And then the other person actually saying, yeah, I'm going through a lot of stuff as well. And then realizing that we're all going through a lot of stuff. None of us is Superman or Superwoman, woman or Supergirl or whatever. That realization is actually quite liberating, because then you're like, oh crap, everyone's the same as me. And then you don't feel as lonely anymore, as if you're the only person in this planet of 7 billion plus people that feels the way you do.
Totally. And it flips the switch too. It flips it from going, oh, why am I suffering, to going, oh, hey, maybe this is the whole reason. Maybe this is the whole point of the experience, is to suffer and grow and be confronted with problems that match your current state of awareness. and capabilities. And those problems never go away. They only grow to match your new level of capability to the degree at which you allow yourself to move through them. So I think that is so important. And you're right, that's a major point. Even if solutions aren't reached, just the conversation is going to be extremely beneficial.
Yeah, and I mean, you touched on the obstacle is the way earlier, and there's some research that's known as the Yerkes-Dodson law, which finds that the relationship between stress and performance, it's kind of like an inverted. It's essentially a bell curve, right? Where no stress is actually not good for you because you're just kind of like vegetating, whatever, just like a jellyfish, essentially. Too much stress is chronic and has all sorts of adverse effects on the body and on the mind. But then the right amount of stress is actually where you get into flow and do your best work. It's how you catch a wave. Like, there is no positive outcome without some stress. And realizing that stress or difficulty is necessary to achieve great things or to live a great life. Once you realize that, it's like, oh, okay, I need to go through this thing for this to be difficult. Like I mentioned before the show, I took up surfing at the age of like 34, and the first 10, 15 times I went out, it was like this Herculean effort, right? I was like just falling over. I'd look over at some kids like 1/3 my age, effortlessly riding barrels. And I was like, man, at that point, I could say I'm just not made for this. But knowing that anything worth doing is worth doing poorly until you can do it well changes the game. And I'm like, I just don't get it yet, but I will soon enough, like as long as I keep getting back up. And it's having that relationship with adversity that I think maybe a lot of today's kids aren't getting, because we're living in this sort of participation trophy generation where everyone gets a trophy. And if everyone gets a trophy, you kind of expect that you'll always get that trophy until you enter the real world. And then you're like, oh no, where's my trophy? And then you can't deal with it. So
yeah,
I know there's a lot in that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I'm not one for equal outcomes. I'm very much one for equal opportunity. But
yes,
the moment we try and dictate outcomes to people, I think we strip them of their emotional fortitude. And that's what we've done to a very large extent. We have a large degree of entitlement factor, going on particularly within Western cultures. And I think often it takes quite a scare or some sort of big moment to actually break that apart. Sometimes it's travel. For me, it certainly was travel when I was younger. And how do we cultivate that on a widespread scale? I think it is going to be having these sometimes difficult conversations of going, hey, how do we put people through tough times whilst keeping them safe? There's a lot of analogies. I think sport is a massive tool there and potential intervention to actually teach people and generate fortitude, because in sport you lose, you struggle, you have to learn. You're often, at some point, you're the worst in the room. There's all these different philosophical underpinnings to sport or learning any skill, in fact, that we can use to enhance that degree of sustainable fortitude. We're always doing these little things now, and we're trying to look after people and nourish them, and that's all great. But at some point, we need to induce some sustained growth in them and prop them up to be able to thrive for the rest of their lives. And I think in the longevity cultures, they do that because life is tough. It's not that easy. They're not sitting back, sipping cocktails and hanging out on hammocks in the Greek islands. They're working. They're working very hard. I spoke with Yorgo, who's an 88-year-old beekeeper, and he's got a big sort of warehouse operation. And a lot of people that work for him, and he was saying it's just like being an athlete. If I stop moving, I'll start dying. And I can't enjoy rest if I'm not tired. So if I'm going to be resting all the time, I'm not going to enjoy it. And it was the same with the old people in Okinawa. Yoshiko, who's a 93-year-old lady who was singing karaoke all day when I was with her. She's got the busiest schedule ever for a 93-year-old. Crazy, right? And she hosted me for a seaweed salad and some green tea and some Okinawan donuts. And she was saying, I don't think of myself as old. I'm too busy to grow old. You know, it's like I've got to do the gardening. I've got to go to choir practice. I've got to go to karaoke. Every Thursday I have one beer at karaoke. I barely drink any water. I just drink some green tea and that's kind of it. You know, so I think these people bring to the table something that we are missing in a very big way, and that's that emotional resilience. That's that cerebral readiness, that sharp tactness that we are absolutely missing here.
Yeah, and I know a lot of influencers like your Tim Ferrisses of the world, or even your Sam Harrises of the world, speak highly of teaching kids or getting kids into wrestling or Brazilian jiu-jitsu and sports like that, where you can't kind of just sit back and let the rest of the team take over. I mean, otherwise you're just going to get tapped out. And, you know, if it's wrestling, you're kind of trying to control the other person's body weight and use your hips to get over them. And if they're on top of you, it's a very difficult place. Like, you can't think about anything else. You just need to focus in on that moment. And in order to get good at it, you just need to pursue. I mean, well, you need to persist. And it reminds me of Calvin Coolidge. He was a former US president who said that nothing in this world would take the place of talent, genius, or education. Persistence alone is omnipotent. And he was saying, you know, the world is full of talented people who got nowhere, educated derelicts, and so on. And it's so true as well, man. Like,
okay, so in this new little location, I think what they do in these cultures is they attribute these small conversations a lot more weight than we do. And I think small talk is conversation without authenticity, not necessarily conversation without depth. It's just in these cultures, when they ask a friend, "Hey, how are you?" It's a very significant question. It's like, "How are you doing? Do you need help from me right now? What's going on in your life?" So that I can listen and learn and know about you and know what's happening. You know, in Okinawa, when I spoke with Yoshiko, they were sort of saying how when they have conversations, it's a lot of the time it's very positive, and that's just because they want to make sure that they're just having a positive experience with one another, and that doesn't mean that they don't talk about their problems, but it means they might put a positive or a funny swing on their problems. So I think that we can achieve impactful conversations with small talk, but we just need to attribute more weight to them. Like, for instance, when I go now walking down the street here in Avalon and I bump into someone that, you know, is more of an acquaintance than a good friend, when I ask them how they are, it's now a much bigger question for me. You know, and it's a much more deeply engaged conversation that ensues, even though it might fall under the category of small talk. So I think that's what I think is the case, because in these cultures, they're not having really deep conversations all the time. A lot of their stuff is a lot of their interactions are very much daily interactions. Like, hey, how's it going? Hey, what's the weather going to do this weekend? You know, and you know, it's been a very dry summer. What are we going to do? You know, so they are quite basic and simple conversations, but they just attribute a lot of presence to them and a lot of weight. And I think that's where the benefits come from. They're doing them multiple times a day. They might have a really big day of work, but they'll see someone and they'll say, okay, hey, I'm going to stop. Work can wait. I'm going to sit down with you. I'm going to have a coffee with you, maybe for 1 or even 2 or 3 hours. You know, this is just the way they work in those cultures. There's always time to have a conversation. Whereas I think when we engage in small talk, it's like, hey, how are you? Sorry, don't have a time. See ya. Yeah. And we just forget it. So I don't know whether that will be supported by the research, but that does sound very interesting though, because I mean, in my house, and in my life, I do love a good conversation about life and health and well-being or philosophy or whatever. So yeah, I think that could sort of go multiple ways.
Yeah. And I mean, it's about being intentional as well about that. And if someone asks you, how are you? Or you ask someone, how are you? Perhaps digging deeper and asking those follow-up questions. And, well, why are you are you really good? Or if someone asks me, how are you? Well, I'll tell them, like, be vulnerable. And then being vulnerable will develop trust and hopefully open them up to actually sharing more as well, which is what I've found when I've gone off to, say, 2 or 3 days sort of retreats where people are just more vulnerable with each other, and you walk away from those events just feeling charged because you had so many substantive, meaningful conversations. And you mentioned wanting to have conversations about philosophy. What I started doing this year was like once a month initially, bringing people over to my house to just riff on a topic, like what will it mean to be human in an AI world or something like that. But just like geeking out on stuff like Joe Rogan 3-4 hour podcast episode style, right? But with no recording. And it's just interesting seeing how people respond to that afterwards. Be like, man, that was so good. I haven't had a conversation like that in so long. And it's just kind of sad that people don't have those conversations. Like they can go weeks, if not months, without those types of conversations in their lives because they're just so used to that sort of, how are you? Good, gotta go, busy. How's work? It's busy, so busy, crazy busy, which is just the default response that we have to everything, which more or less says that we're out of control as opposed to actually being effective. But I think
it comes back to engagement. I think what you're talking about is engagement.
Yeah.
The people in these cultures, that the elderly especially, are so engaged with what's going on. They're not just drifting through life, not concerned about their environment. They're very concerned about the island. They're concerned about the people on the island. In Okinawa, I've met a 102-year-old who read the newspaper every single day, and she was particularly engaged with the American naval base and that being there. She didn't want it there. And that problem gave her a little sense of purpose. And I think when we open up ourselves to those experiences that do give us a strong sense of purpose and engagement and curiosity, then we are it gives us a reason to stick around. And it gives us a reason to function well. I think a lot of us fall inside the trap of, hey, I'm just going to move through life and survive today, because I'm so busy. I've just got to get through it. I've got to get all this stuff done, and then I'm going to get to bed because I'm exhausted. What I think we need to do is start to shape our lives in a way that opens up the door for more authentic expression of who we are. And because when we do that, we're going to be more engaged. We're going to feel more engaged. For me, it's, it's film, and it's all the troubles of film, and it's all the joys of film as well. I've got to engage with all those different areas in order to succeed. I mean, at the moment, I'm managing animations in the film. I'm doing the final adjustments on the timeline literally today as we speak, before dropping the file off to be mixed and turned into a cinema file. I'm managing the book that's being done and accompanying the film, the longevity book, and we're also now looking at the next projects of how we're going to get funding and work with the government and work with education programs to do some stuff on kids' health, and then also do my narrative stuff, my fiction TV series that I want to make out in the country in South Australia, So it's a very, very different things. And I could just go, hey, this is too stressful. This is too stressful. I've got too much on. And that's probably what I would have done a long time ago. I would have, or even probably 2 years ago when we did the gut movie, it was totally overwhelming. And I didn't thrive during that process. But now being armed with this new perspective on how to live a life that is engaged, that does appreciate the essential pillars of well-being and longevity, I feel like it's been a much easier process, because even though it's been frantic and hectic, I've been approaching it with a steady state, and this great sense of calm that has only come from a new perspective. It hasn't come from taking a tablet or taking some adaptogenic herbs that calm me down or taking some Tulsi tea. It's been about it's perspective. So I think, when we do that, we are going to generate a much more engaged population. And in order to do that, we need to encourage people to actually live a life that is in alignment with what they really, truly want to do. And if you want to work out what that is, you ask yourself the question, what do you think about all the time? What do you daydream about? What would you do regardless of money, of being paid for it or not? For me, it's film and surfing. And so I've built my life now around film and surfing. And I will continue to do that. And I hope that keeps me engaged and on purpose, and then inspired to look after myself from a nutrition and movement perspective as well.
Yeah. And I think what you've talked through there kind of dispels some, I suppose, false dichotomies, if you will, between, that calm perspective and ambition and achievement. Because some people might think, oh yeah, but if I take this approach, I'm going to lose my edge, right? But if you look at whether it's Stoicism and the writings of Marcus Aurelius, or even Taoism, where phrases like the contented man is rich are quite fundamental to that whole sort of belief system. Being contented doesn't mean that you suddenly quit everything you were doing and just go, sit on a hammock in the Greek islands, like you were saying. It just means that you can then operate or navigate the world with a sense of calm. That means you can actually make better decisions and focus on getting shit done without becoming overwhelmed and stressed and reliant on all sorts of antidepressants just to survive.
Yeah, and I think it's not even just antidepressants that we medicate ourselves with. It's social media, it's wine, it's people in these cultures drink wine, by the way, but it's binge drinking. It's smashing ourselves at the gym to punish ourselves for eating too much the day before.
Yeah.
We tend to oscillate between extremes here in the West, and what I think optimal or graceful ages do, and people in these longevity cultures do, is they operate at a more moderate intensity throughout their entire life, and in doing so, they burn that candle slowly, and they reach a ripe old age, and they do it without getting sick. Whereas us oscillating between extremes, we just get sick. We burn out too easily, and we need to start avoiding that. And that starts with a new perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, couldn't agree more. And you mentioned these communities drink wine, and I know they drink a lot of wine, and they love their goat's cheese and their olives and whatnot. Were there any sort of lessons on the nutrition front that you took out of these communities?
A big thing for me that I was surprised by, I actually thought going into it, I was like, I'm probably going to have to just discard a lot of my nutrition ideas. But I did to an extent. But one thing that really struck me was the amount of organic produce that these guys are consuming, and most of it homegrown. So a lot of the people in Okinawa and Ikaria, for instance, grow their own produce, and they do so organically. When you even mention the idea of putting chemicals on their gardens, it's like, no way. That stuff is poisonous. We're not going to give it to ourselves or give it to our children. Yeah. And they value growing your own food. It's a mark of pride to be able to grow your own food and supply your family with that food. So that's a big, big thing. And then in Loma Linda, which is essentially part of Western culture, there's no geographical boundary separating Loma Linda from the rest of California. It's a Seventh-day Adventist community. That's the biggest difference between them and the rest. They're mostly pescatarian or vegetarian, so they naturally have more of a health inclination in that they do consume a lot of whole foods. As part of the medical training there at Loma Linda University, they teach whole foods cooking principles. So it's a very particular community there around nutrition within Western society. So they do have some gardens that, probably very similar to what's going on here in the Northern Beaches. But they have that vegetarian element, which comes from the Seventh-day Adventist influence, is to avoid eating excessive red meat and a whole bunch of different things. That has been translated into them being vegetarians. But if you look at Okinawa, they're not vegetarians. They do eat a lot of vegetables, but they still have some meat. They'll have a lot of pork. They'll have some wild pig. They'll have a lot of seafood. In Ikaria, they have a lot of goat. They've got a huge amount of wild goat throughout the island, and they'll have that. And I got to have some at the Panigiri, the big party, and that was 700 kilos of slow cooked goat going around, and the broth from that goat as well being served up for everyone. It's the best meat I've ever had in my life, Yeah. So to all those people who are sort of saying that you have to go vegan or vegetarian to live a long time, that's not true. These guys, and if you actually do that, you actually miss out on. Dr. Mark Hyman talked about this in my interview with him. Leucine is one of the very important amino acid that we need, particularly in younger years and also older years. And if you see vegans in the older years, they tend to get very thin and very frail. And he talked about muscle loss is essentially the disease of aging. Hip fractures are one of the number one killers of people over the age of 65. So we do actually need some animal protein throughout those later years, or I guess a very, very, very diligent vegan regimen to actually tick off the nutritional box if you were able to do it.
Yeah.
To achieve an optimal sort of space in that arena. But, at the same time, if eating meat gives you so much stress that it affects everything else, then it's probably not going to be good for you. So, but the point is that these cultures do eat meat. They just eat very little of it. I'm talking maybe 15% of their diet comes from meat. The rest of it comes from a slow sort of approach, seasonal, local, organic, and whole foods.
Mm-hmm. Oh, love that. Love that acronym. It's interesting what you say about food, because I guess nowadays there's a lot of tribalism even when it comes to food. It's like, I'm a vegan, I'm paleo, I'm keto, I'm this, I'm that. And people wrap up so much of their identity in this thing, oftentimes at the expense of just working their way towards what is best for them. And then, it's the nature of science. It's like the physicist Richard Feynman said, we can never be sure we're right. We can only ever be sure we're wrong. And the aim is to get towards more right by falsifying hypotheses. And so what we are today, we might think we know something about diet, about work, about whatever, but by opening ourselves up to constant testing, adaptation, iteration, we'll get towards what is most right for us. And that also applies with nutrition, right? And just having that open mind goes such a long way.
It does. And it's very difficult to study diets. You can only do it observationally unless you trap people in a room for 6 months and then even 6 years to look at long-term effects and control everything that they eat. It's almost impossible to study diet. The best thing I think we can do is look at cultures who eat commonly amongst common themes and look at the results that they're getting. And if we look at people who consume a more Mediterranean style diet, that is a bucket load of fruits and vegetables, some nuts, some seeds, a little bit of goat's milk or whatever, and some eggs and a little bit of meat, then they tend to have really far better health statistics. And I mean, there was one study that I thought was particularly interesting in down at Deakin University, down where you are, that used a whole foods Mediterranean style diet to actually reverse depression in 33% of patients. And this was serious depression, major depression. And they did that by assigning them a diet. But you also have to go, well, hey, what are the limitations to that? What else did these people do when we sent them away with their dietary plan? Did they actually stick to it? So there's a whole bunch of caveats that come in with any sort of dietary science. But again, for me, that goes, okay, well, hey, let's forget about that. Let's go, hey, who's doing things consistently, and let's go and see what the results they're getting are. And that's what we did with the longevity film. It's looking at those cultures, like the Icarians, like the Loma Lindens, like the Okinawans, and then extended, we didn't go to them, but the Sardinia and the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, they are all living this lifestyle that allows them to eat a seasonal, local, often homegrown, organic whole foods diet that comes from a mixed variety of food kingdoms. So if we're actually to appreciate that research and appreciate the results that they're getting, and we want something similar, then we should probably start to reapproximate what they're doing here. Yeah. And this is my version of reapproximating, is that little garden patch right there.
Awesome.
It's just little tiny things that we bring into our lives that have a massive difference in the end.
Yeah, they do. And, even being from Melbourne, at least once a week, I like to drive down to Ocean Grove, which is perhaps the closest surf beach to where I live. It's about an hour and 10-minute drive. And just going out there for a couple of hours, usually for a sunset surf, just changes my whole disposition. So like that veggie patch in your backyard, like that surf once a week at least, I am just a totally different person coming out of there. It's like the water just washes away any sort of negative anxiety or whatever that I had, at least for a 24 to 48 hour period. It's amazing what it can do for you.
It's incredible. That's why I surf every day, and that's why 100 meters that way is some of the best surf in Sydney. So
100 meters is preferable to an hour drive, man, that's for sure. It's funny what you say about veganism as well, and at the risk of offending a few vegans, it's funny whenever I ask the question, well, where are you getting your protein from? And the answer oftentimes is, I just have nuts. And I think, well, you got to eat a lot of nuts to make up for, say, one chicken fillet. And you're going to, not only is it nuts, but nuts come with a side of carbs and all sorts of, and fats. And fats can be good for you. And I eat a lot of nuts. But at the same time, it's not apples for apples. It's about really educating yourself about, well, are you substituting meat with something that's exactly like it? Or is it totally different with just a bit of protein.
Yeah, and I mean, I can speak from experience here. I'm not a critic of veganism as an approach. I'm actually just a critic of fanaticism, and that whole sort of religious style approach to food. Because I used to be a vegan. I was actually a raw vegan for a year,
wow.
And it was really good for me for 6 months, and then over the next 6 months, I actually began to decline. And that's when I started listening to my body and actually consuming some animal protein again. And again, it really comes down to, it's not about what is right or wrong, because that's going to be different as per the individual.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to be a conversation about what are your goals and what are the outcomes you want to achieve. And then that's when you sort of decide your approach. And for these longevity cultures, they're not going, I want to be shredded. I want to be, I want to be super lean, and I want to activate my testosterone levels. So I'm going to fast every morning. They don't do that. They just have a tradition around food and they follow that. It's and then if they wanted to get shredded, maybe they would do keto, but they don't.
Yeah.
If they wanted to look after animals and not be involved with any sort of killing of animals, then maybe they would go vegan. But that's the key thing, is that we need to consider the results that we want to achieve, and then live a life that's in accordance with that. And that probably, again, we're zooming in on nutrition now. That's the same with everything. What do we want to achieve in life? And are we living in alignment with a way that's going to help us do that? It's a pretty, if we strip everything back, it's a pretty simple question.
Yes, but oftentimes common sense isn't so common, right? So
No.
especially in the West, where our common sense has been, I guess you could say, polluted by lots of materialism and whatnot, particularly through various media channels, which has only been amplified by social media, which unfortunately a lot of kids are seeing as a surrogate for self-worth in some ways as well. Yeah,
and I think it's a shortcut to feeling like we belong. Is to identify with something. So this is why we see such a large split in politics, for instance, and also in personal politics to the left and the right. You're either extreme right, you're extreme left.
Yeah.
No one's commonsensical, logical, centered anymore. And to be able to be centered, you need to be very comfortable with yourself and go, hey, yeah, you're right, but you're also right, because I can see where you're coming from.
Yeah.
That takes a lot of self-worth, I think, and people unfortunately don't have a lot of self-worth. So when they see an easy access point to a tribe, they'll jump for that, because we are so lonely, because we are not comfortable anymore.
Yeah.
And so it's understandable, but I don't think it's going to lead to long-term health and happiness for a lot of people.
No, and it is easy to look for that fast track to moral righteousness just by associating yourself with being, that you mentioned far left, being Antifa or being a vegan or being whatever it is, because then you suddenly adopt all of the principles and values of this organization, which you think is holier than thou in some way, and therefore that makes you holier than thou. And that means you don't have to do any work, because now I am this and I am holy. So,
well, yeah, and you don't have to think or consider what your own beliefs are, which is the biggest thing. I mean, if we had to group myself, I'd be very centered socially, but environmentally, for instance, I'd probably be more left, because, I don't want to see this earth raped and ravaged until there's nothing left. So to be able to swim in your own lane is such a powerful approach to life, because it makes you feel comfortable with who you are, and it encourages conversation and discernment and thought and consideration about everything, and that's ultimately going to lead to only a more informed approach.
Yeah, and maybe we can wrap up with this, Kale, on challenging your own beliefs. How has making this film challenged your own beliefs or your own approach to how you manage your health?
Totally, everything. Literally every aspect of life. And that's, I think, it is a mark of pride for me in a way that I'm so open that I can reinvent the wheel constantly and document that and be open to document. I mean, that's probably one of my driving forces behind these films, that I'm just curious about things, and I'm very open to to new ideas and changing. So for me, around nutrition, I thought it was going to change a lot, but it's very much been reinforced around the slow approach, so the seasonal, local, organic approach, and very much a growing your own approach. I think that is a very empowering, liberating health tool. Movement for me now, it's not about going to the gym. It's more about finding excuses and reasons to move constantly throughout the day. So not sitting for 8 or 10 hours, which most Australians do, and then going and smash myself at the gym for 45 minutes. Yeah. It's about building movement into my life. So living a lifestyle that encourages movement. So it's going surfing in the morning, but then it's also going for a walk into the village. Even if I don't really have a reason to go in the village, it's going for a walk into the village to get a coffee or get a Medi mushroom latte, just to actually get out there and move my body. And then it might be going to yoga later in the day. So it's very much about constant movement now for me, whereas before I would have felt fine mentally, not necessarily physically, by not moving all day and then going to the gym. Around community, it's changed a lot. It's gone from me wanting to be a lot more isolated and going, no, I don't like people. And it's very easy to not like people as a whole, but it's very hard to dislike people individually. And I think I was giving myself that scapegoat of not seeing people very often individually. So now it's very much about building community into my life. So going to those cafes and conversing with people, and having the coffee there and sitting down and chatting and building in social anchors. When we try and have social gatherings, for instance, I think there is that natural tendency, especially nowadays with lastminute.com, to avoid those and avoid commitment to those. So it's very much now about, I'm going to go and surf that one spot that I know 4 or 5 people will be out there and I'll have conversations with them, as opposed to chasing down an empty bank on my own somewhere. And then with attitude, it's very much been about slowing down and being more patient and calm and appreciating, using, this has been massive, is using what I previously thought were problems and annoyances as anchors to be present, and to actually appreciate what's going on and work through them and work from the idea that yes, those obstacles are probably actually the meaning of this whole experiences, because they're going to be the most common theme. The tour of the film is the last 5% of the project, so I've got to actually find ways to enjoy the 95% of the project. I'm probably at 70% right now, but I think that's a pretty good outcome from 5%. So yeah, there have been some massive changes, and I'm not saying that I'll never change again, but right now it's had a big impact on my life, and I hope that journey, we've documented it well enough to inspire other people to actually consider their own life as well. Whether they change or not, it doesn't matter, just as long as they're thinking and considering what they're doing and whether it's working for them is the goal.
Fantastic. Beautifully said. So having talked about this film for the last hour or so, when can people head out to see it?
So it's we're starting the tour very soon, in about a month's time, and we're starting in Sydney, then going to Melbourne and Adelaide and the rest around Australia, Perth, all out north, around down the east coast, and that's all at kalebrock.com. So KALEBROCK.com. And they can also check it out on Instagram if they want as well.
Fantastic. And they can hit you up on Instagram at Kale's Broccoli as well. I love that tag. And also, check out your books, The Gut Healing Protocol, The Art of Probiotic Nutrition, Mandy Microbe's Big Gut Adventure, and the forthcoming The Longevity Book. So all of that good stuff can be found over at kalebrock.com. Kale, thank you so much for your time, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Steve. See you, mate.
Hi, guys. Steve again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to receive a weekly email from me, complete with reflections, books I've been reading, words of wisdom, and access to blogs, ebooks, and more that I'm publishing on a regular basis, just leave your details at futuresquared.xyz/subscribe and you'll receive the very next one. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, take a minute to like, share, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It goes a long way to giving the podcast the exposure it needs so I can continue bringing you guests and conversations of the highest caliber. You can catch me on Twitter at Steve Gliveski and on Instagram at TheSteveGliveski. Until next time.
Hasta la vista, baby.